Then Joseph could not control himself before all those who stood by him. He cried, "Make everyone go out from me." So no one stayed with him when Joseph made himself known to his brothers. And he wept aloud, so the Egyptians heard it, and the household of Pharaoh heard it. And Joseph said to his brothers, "I am Joseph. Is my father still alive?" But his brothers could not answer him, for they were dismayed at his presence. So Joseph said to his brothers, "Come near to me, please." And they came near. And he said, "I am your brother Joseph, whom you sold into Egypt. And now do not be distressed or angry with yourselves because you sold me here. For God sent me before you to preserve life. For the famine has been in the land these 2 years, and there are yet 5 years in which there will be neither plowing nor harvest. And God sent me before you to preserve for you a remnant on earth and to keep many alive as survivors. So it was not you who sent me here, but God."
Amen. What we have here today is a story of triumph over evil. The story of Joseph. I used to sit and read this story almost every Sunday. I'm the son of a preacher, and while he was preaching, I was reading Old Testament stories. That's better than nothing, right? Better than daydreaming or doing other stuff. I love the Old Testament stories. And this one about Joseph was my favorite story. It covers a lot of chapters, right? And what you have, it starts in chapter 37. What's so interesting about the way that, and I don't even know why I'm getting into this, but the literary thing is that there's often an overlap thing that happens. So chapter 37 goes with chapters 39 through 50 of Genesis, and chapter 38 goes with what came before. So we have the first story about Joseph, and then 38 continues with Judah from before, and then 39 continues with Joseph. It's a cool literary technique. Anyway, we won't get into that right now, even though I just did. But it starts in 37, and then the story of Joseph goes all the way through chapter 50 of Genesis. So it's long and it's involved, but it's a story of triumph over evil. It's a story of loss and profound abuse. But it's a story of God's mercy and God's sovereign plan. It's a story of faith and forgiveness. It's a story of how God works and how God is trustworthy. It's a story of the gospel, and I believe it's a story of that it's a story that we need to hear and we need to embrace if we ever are going to be good evangelists. You may think that's strange. So what I want us to see in these verses is that everything that happens to us in our lives is tailor-made for us to be effective in the kingdom. Maybe you haven't thought of it that way. Everything that has happened to us is tailor-made, uniquely made for us to be effective in the kingdom. What I hope to do today is to show you from this passage that our effectiveness in evangelism and our usefulness in the kingdom depends on how well we embrace our stories. In other words, you can't know where you're going until you embrace where you've been. Okay? You can't know where you're going until you embrace where you've been. So what we have here is a story of how God uses Joseph to save his people, but the path that Joseph had to travel to get there was a path of untold suffering and loss and injustice. So how did Joseph embrace his past? Well, the very first thing I want us to see from this passage is forgiveness. Forgiveness. He embraces his past by forgiving. And I think we have it here in verse 5 of our passage this morning. And now do not be distressed or angry with yourselves because you sold me here, for God sent me before you to preserve life. He's talking to his brothers. These are actually astounding words coming from Joseph. These are words of acceptance and love and forgiveness because his brothers had subjected him to untold injustice and suffering. They actually hated him for numerous reasons. Their father, Jacob, had 4 wives. He only loved one of them. And he only really loved the 2 sons that came from that wife, Joseph and his brother Benjamin. All the other sons, there were 10 other sons, were just there. And they knew that Joseph was the favorite one. So they hated him because he was their father's favorite. On top of that, Joseph was telling him these dreams like as if they were going to bow down to him. So he told them the first dream, and they hated him all the more because of it. He knew that they hated him. So then he decides to tell them another dream. Well, he had the protection of his father. He was the favorite of his father. And they were looking for an opportunity to get rid of him. See, that's what hate does. You turn it over and over in your mind and you begin to imagine ways to hurt the other person. When you have been injured, it's so easy to keep turning it over and over and over in your mind, and it turns into hate, and it turns into ways of getting back at them. Most action movies today are about revenge. Don't you love them? The guy comes in and blows everybody away. Well, the opportunity for the brothers arose when Jacob sent Joseph to check on his brothers. They'd been gone for numerous days. He didn't know where they were, so he sends Joseph off to check on them. Well, Joseph obviously was pretty oblivious to their hate for him for some reason, or Jacob was oblivious to it. He would have never sent Joseph to go find them. But when Joseph finally finds his brothers, the text says, and this is, the text says in chapter 37, verse 18, they saw him from afar, and before he came near to them, they conspired against him to kill him. See, that is jealousy and hate all wrapped up into one. It doesn't get much more evil than that. And these brothers, these are the same brothers that just a few chapters before this had gone into Shechem. The prince of Shechem had actually violated their sister, and they conspired with it, and they went in and they killed all the men of Shechem. This was the brothers. They were certainly capable of killing, and they were certainly capable of killing Joseph. And so they were plotting. They were going to take him. This was their opportunity. Here he was. Joseph was coming. Their father was nowhere to be seen. But it was only because of Reuben, the oldest one, who didn't. He said, let's put him in a pit here, because he was going to come by later. He had compassion on the boy for his father's sake, and so he was going to save him later. And he talks them into putting him in a pit. Now imagine what Joseph is feeling. He's been taken, probably stripped down. He's thrown into this pit. He's probably crying out, what are you guys doing? But when Reuben isn't there, they see this band of Midianites come by that are on their way to Egypt, and they decide, let's just sell him. Let's just get rid of him. Then we don't have blood on our hands. We can just send him on down there. And that's exactly what they did. They just sold him. Can you imagine what Joseph is thinking? You're selling me, the horror of it. Or as most of you say, the horror of it. But it's my Northeastern accent, horror, so sorry. The horror of it. Can you imagine that? He's being ripped away from his father, from everything he knows. He has no idea what's going to happen to him. He is not under anybody's protection anymore. Anything can actually happen to him. He must have been terrified. He would never go home again. He was completely helpless and vulnerable. I don't think we can understand fully how he felt. And he went through a whole series of difficulties down in Egypt, as you know. You can read it in the text. He became a slave of Potiphar, who was the captain of the guard for Pharaoh. And though he rose to a high position there, he was falsely accused by Potiphar's wife, and he was sent to prison where he languished for numerous years. So all told, from the time he was taken into slavery until he came to prominence, what we have in our passage today, 45, where he was the second in command in Egypt. He had come to prominence. But the time between when he was sold into slavery and he came into prominence was 13 years. 13 years of suffering, of limbo, of wondering what God is up to. 13 years of being subjected to injustice because of his brothers. And you can imagine that he would have been tempted to think about them and be angry. So how do we get from these 13 years of injustice to the Joseph of our passage this morning, who is more concerned for his brothers than anything else, and who is the savior of his people? How do you get there? From being completely falsely accused and suffering for 13 years to the one who says to his brothers, now do not be distressed or angry with yourselves because you sold me here, for God sent me to preserve your life. How does he get there? Well, the very first thing is forgiveness, right? Forgiveness. Why is it necessary to forgive those who have done you wrong? Well, there are probably many reasons. But not least of all, is that a lack of forgiveness will destroy you because it stokes resentment. Those who don't forgive are the ones left with the resentment. The other person isn't even thinking about it. Max Lucado, in his book, The Applause of Heaven, says, resentment is when you let your hurt become hate. Resentment is when you allow what is eating you to eat you up. Resentment is when you poke, stoke, feed, and fan the fire, stirring the flames and reliving the pain. Resentment is the deliberate decision to nurse the offense until it becomes a black, furry, growling grudge. And that black, furry, growling grudge will destroy you. So what is forgiveness? I honestly think we have to distinguish between how you feel in the moment and what you do. Sometimes you have to step out in faith and say, Lord, you're going to have to change my heart, but this is what I'm going to do. And this is what it is to forgive. When someone does something against you, it means they owe you. They've done something to you and they should pay. This is how we feel about the criminal justice system, right? If someone commits a crime, they need to pay for that crime. They need to do something to pay for it. So it's the same way with anyone that does anything against us. They owe us. And we want to exact payment. But here's forgiveness. Forgiveness is when you don't hold the penalty against them. In other words, you pay the price yourself by assuming the cost of what was done to you. You assume the cost. And how do you do that? By treating them as if they never hurt you, by freely lavishing grace on them, by never bringing the subject up again with them, by never getting allies and talking with others about them, by never mulling it over in your mind. See, forgiveness means we assume the debt as if it were we who had caused the harm. It's assuming the debt. And it's not your debt anymore, it's mine. I won't hold it against you anymore. It doesn't mean that you completely trust the other person. They may have done untold abuse to you. It doesn't mean you trust them. But to forgive them means you let them off the hook. They don't owe you anything anymore. You are assuming their debt. Brothers and sisters, so many of us carry around burdens from our past. Some of you have unspeakable burdens. Things that have been done to you. There are things that just seem unforgivable. And yet the DNA of this passage is that Joseph forgave his brothers in spite of the complete injustice and horror that they perpetrated against him. See, Jesus puts it this way in the Sermon on the Mount, but I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. And then a little later he says, for if you forgive others their trespasses, your heavenly Father will also forgive you. But if you do not forgive others their trespasses, neither will your Father forgive your trespasses. The only way to embrace our past is to forgive. We've got to forgive. This is the call of the gospel on our lives. But it's not the only thing. How do you do the forgiveness? Well, number two, it's that we've got to see the big picture. We have got to see the big picture. See, we will never be able to forgive, and we will never be able to embrace our past unless we see the big picture. And what is amazing about Joseph is that he walked with God. In the middle of all of his 13 years of difficulty, he walked with God. So when he was at Potiphar's house, Potiphar's wife was attracted to him, and so she propositioned him day after day. It seemed to go on for quite a while, but he kept refusing her, and the reason was that he didn't want to sin against God. See, if he had given in to her, his life actually might have gotten better, right? She might have even actually helped him win his freedom. Who knows what might have come in the short term? There were all kinds of possibilities to get in good with the boss's wife, but he doesn't care about any of that. He is much more concerned with God and with sinning against God. Chapter 39, verse 9 says, how then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God? Why are so many things difficult for us? And why have we lived through some things that we've had to live through? Well, it's because God has a bigger plan than we can even imagine. It's not the plan that we might have thought up. It's not the plan that perhaps we have dreamed about. It's in fact a better plan. I would dare say that most of our plans are self-centered dreams about some easy future where we can retire and we can enjoy ourselves. They center around dreams for our children and our grandchildren, dreams of prosperity, dreams of ease for them and for us. These generally tend to be the American types of dreams that we have. Usually our dreams are about things that we think feel right, but most of the time they're dead ends. They really are dead ends, and God knows this. He knows this, and he brings things into our lives so that he will shake us out of our dreams, and then we wonder, where is God? Let's say you have a delicious pecan pie in front of you, and let's say that the pie represents your entire life. This is your whole life. If you take one teeny little morsel of crumb from the crust, that's more than you actually know about your whole life, about the whole pie. But God knows all of it. We know almost nothing. Brothers and sisters, most of the time we make decisions acting as if we know what we're talking about. But most things are way above our pay grade. And suffering and difficulty and limbo are right in that category. It is way above our pay grade. I think my favorite psalm is Psalm 131. Oh Lord, my heart is not lifted up. My eyes are not raised too high. I do not occupy myself with things too great and too marvelous for me, but I have calmed and quieted my soul like a weaned child with its mother. Like a weaned child is my soul within me. O Israel, hope in the Lord from this time forth and forevermore. See, this is a psalm about the big picture, and it's telling me I don't need to know everything. I only need to trust the one who not only sees everything, but controls everything. There are things too big for me, too wonderful for me to understand. Why do I always have to be in the know on everything? Why can't I just say, I take this from your hand, the good and the bad? See, if we're questioning God when he throws bad things into our lives, then we really didn't want God for his sake anyway. We were just using God to get us to have nice lives. But as soon as something bad comes, we begin to doubt that he's good. We were manipulating him in the first place. But what it's telling us is that he is the all-powerful one, the sovereign one that loves us and has control of our lives, the good, the bad, and everything in between. Every single one of us, brothers and sisters, has wounds that we have struggled to get over. Some of them, of course, have been self-imposed. Some of them have been imposed on us by others. Joseph had both, I'm convinced. I don't think he helped himself by telling dreams and living in front of his brothers. He had full protection of his father. They hated him because he seemed to flaunt what he had. But of course, what was imposed on him wasn't deserved either. To be ripped away from his father, and at first thinking he was going to die, but then to be sold as a slave, and then to spend many years in a dungeon for something he did not do. That was complete injustice. But let's look at what he says, verses 5-8. And now do not be distressed or angry with yourselves because you sold me here, for God sent me before you to preserve life. For the famine has been in the land for 2 years, and there are yet 5 years in which there will be neither plowing nor harvest. And God sent me before you to preserve for you a remnant on earth, and to keep alive for you many survivors. So it was not you who sent me here, but God. He says it 3 times. Verse 5, for God sent me before you to preserve life. Verse 7, God sent me before you to preserve for you a remnant on earth. Verse 8, so it was not you who sent me here, but God. In 3 short verses, he says it 3 times. He is so utterly convinced this is how he can forgive his brothers, because there's a bigger picture. People do all kinds of evil things, and some of you have suffered untold evil. Do we understand why evil happens? No. No. It's above our pay grade. We don't know how evil and God's plan collide, but we do know this. As evil as the brothers were, Joseph is convinced that they were merely pawns in God's overall plan, and that it was necessary for this plan to happen this way, which means that whatever has happened to you, it was for a very good purpose. What could that purpose be? Well, there probably are many, but I'm going to focus on one. And here's my third point. The bridge to the world. Joseph was the man of the hour, right? The man that God would use to save his people. He had him rise up into prominence in Egypt. He was a spoiled rich kid, I think. Some people take issue with that, but I'll stand by it. We can argue about it. He was his father's favorite because he was, as I said, the son of his father's favorite wife, and his father gave him a coat of many colors. Now, this coat of many colors was extremely symbolic. It wasn't just that he gave him a nice coat, okay? He gave him this coat. This coat was actually a sign of predominance. What do I mean by that? Do you remember that Jacob, the father, was the youngest brother? In the ancient world, the oldest brother was the one that had the birthright and inherited the vast majority of the estate and became the next patriarch. But you remember that in his case, his brother Esau sold him the birthright, but God had chosen him, the youngest, over his brother Esau. So that when you hear about God, he says he's the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, right? Not Esau. And so here you have you have Jacob seeing Joseph. He's the 11th son. And he has in mind that this is the son that will inherit, will be the predominant one. And giving him the coat was almost a symbol of royalty, that he was passing the torch on to his son, and it was going to be the God of Jacob, of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. That Joseph would be the next one. But of course, God has other plans. See, this is what happens. We have all these plans. We have all these things. Well, Jacob actually needed for Joseph to go away. See how God rips out the idolatry away from people? I mean, it was hard for Joseph, but think about Jacob, who had put all of his hopes in the future of the family in Joseph. He had put all of his hopes there, and suddenly they bring him his coat with blood on it. They say he's dead. What? God, what is going on here? See, this symbolism of the coat is not just happenstance. See, God has other plans. Imagine a teenager getting this kind of preference over his brothers. He was a rich kid that wasn't ready to lead anyone anywhere. And so what does God do? God has to teach him that in the most dire of circumstances, in the darkest moments, that God could be trusted no matter the outcome. See, isn't that the Christian life, brothers and sisters? God can be trusted no matter the outcome. The outcome is above our pay grade. It is not something we need to be concerned about. We need to press into God. Why? Well, because he's the one that holds our future. And there are many other reasons, but consider this reason. It might just be that you are the only one equipped to bring someone else into the kingdom and be used by God to save them. Do you hear that? I'm doing an evangelism internship with a man named Al Dayhoff. And he has a book called Genius in Your Wound. And he says there is a genius in your wound. What does he mean? He means that the wounds that you have accumulated over your life make you completely unique in terms of usefulness in the kingdom, because it is very possible that your background, your woundedness, your struggles, and your unique chemistry are the only things that will actually build a bridge to some people. Joseph was the only one in his family that was crazy gifted in administration. Everywhere he went, he rose to the top as the leader, as the boss, as the one who administrated everything. He was crazy gifted at administration. He had no idea about that when he was a kid. He was still too young to know. He was spoiled. He didn't love his family well. He needed the rough edges smoothed out. See, what God needs is people that will love well, that can be honest about their past, that can forgive, knowing that their past is God's plan for them, that can actually be thankful for their past and embrace their past and look for that bridge into an unbelieving world. Joseph needed 13 years of complete injustice. How many years do you need? And what was his conclusion? So it was not you who sent me here, but God. Maybe you can't get past your own past. I wallowed in mine for a long time. Still do sometimes. Maybe you're angry with God because he's allowed you to go through what you've had to go through. I have two things to say in conclusion. I don't understand why God exactly allows such deep suffering, but I certainly know what it's not, and I've said this before. It's not that he doesn't care, because he came himself and suffered completely unjustly. You and I actually deserve worse than we've gotten. Jesus didn't deserve anything, and yet on the cross he says, Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing. He suffered for you. He suffered for me. I think he can be trusted with the reason why he has put us through suffering. He actually can be trusted with that. And the second thing is this. I truly think that we need to look at our suffering differently. We can wallow in it. We can think about it. We can be angry about it. We can mull it over in our minds, or we can even forgive, but we're just wondering and we're stuck with all this and we don't know what to do with it. And our past is just haunting us all the time. But the more I have gotten out to the mall to talk with people, the more healthy I think my thinking has become. Why? Because there have been numerous things that people have said that I immediately resonated with because I've gone through it. I immediately resonate because I've gone through some of those things. I'm looking for a bridge. We need to be looking for a bridge, a common bond of suffering that is common to everyone, to believers and unbelievers alike. See, there's this common bond of suffering, and we can build a bridge to people. It can't be top down. I'm telling you what you need to believe. What it is an empathy. I'm longing to tell them about my Jesus who suffered for me. Would you be willing to have this kind of kingdom mindset? Would you be willing to pray about this and maybe turn whatever it is in your past and say, I actually might be thinking wrong about this. And I need to start thinking about how that can be used in a bridge into the culture. Are we willing to have this kind of kingdom mindset about our past so that we can forgive and embrace it and use it as a bridge? I think that's what the gospel's about. And really, the gospel changes everything. Let's pray.